Have you ever wondered why you wake up from a full night's sleep and still feel like you've run a marathon in your dreams? Why being around people, even those you care about, leaves you hollow instead of whole? It's not just physical tiredness. It's not just stress. It's something far deeper. An exhaustion that lives in your spirit rather than your muscles. You show up with compassion. You listen more deeply than most. You hold space for the chaos of everyone else's storms, while quietly swallowing your own. And still, as you sit in silence afterward, a question loops endlessly in your mind. Am I doing enough? Am I enough? But what if I told you this isn't normal fatigue at all? What if this constant drain is the result of carrying emotions that were never yours to begin with? Carl Jung might have called it absorption, an unconscious process where you don't just sense what others feel, you internalize it as if it belongs to you. That's why no amount of rest feels like recovery, because you're not only managing your own life, you're unknowingly carrying fragments of everyone else's. Think back to your earliest memories. Maybe you were the child who knew when to stay quiet before an argument erupted. Maybe you learned how to read every twitch in a parent's face, every pause in their voice. Without knowing it, you became an emotional translator long before you even had the words. What looked like empathy was, in fact, survival. You weren't just sensitive. You were adapting to a world that felt unpredictable, and the world praised you for it. They called you mature, responsible, strong. But no one ever stopped to ask at what cost. Because here's the truth, the highly sensitive child often grows into the overly responsible adult, not because they want to fix everyone, but because they never learned that they didn't have to. And so now you find yourself exhausted, but not just in your body, you're tired in your soul. Tired of pretending not to notice how much you notice. Tired of trying to be okay with things that quietly drain you. Tired of always being the healer, never the one who is held. This is sacred exhaustion, a breaking point that isn't collapse, but awakening. The empathy that once distorted your boundaries is now revealing them. The emotions that once drowned you are now pointing toward your power. Because the truth is, you were never too sensitive. You were never too much. You were simply never taught how to protect what makes you different. Think about it. Have you ever walked away from a conversation, barely saying a word, yet feeling as if you'd been wrung dry? Have you ever sat across from someone, smiling politely, while your chest carried a weight you couldn't explain? Maybe you brushed it off, told yourself to toughen up. But what if that sensation wasn't weakness? What if it was wisdom, a signal from your body that you've absorbed something unspoken, something heavy that didn't belong to you? Real life isn't always dramatic arguments or screaming matches. It's the subtle betrayals, the quiet resentments, the unspoken disappointments that fill a room like invisible smoke. It's your partner saying, "I'm fine," with a tone that twists your stomach. It's the coworker whose sadness enters the room before they do. It's the family gathering where everyone is smiling, but your nervous system tells you something darker is humming beneath the surface. That exhaustion you carry isn't random. It's empathic data. Information absorbed from others, logged into your body as if it's your own. And over years, decades even, this slow leak of energy erodes your sense of self, not because you're broken, but because you were never shown how to filter what you feel. Carl Jung believed the unconscious speaks through symbols and sensations before it ever reaches words. For empaths, this means your body often tells the truth long before your mind catches up. That knot in your stomach, that tightness in your chest, that sudden wave of dread, they aren't flaws. They are signals. They are your nervous system's language, and they are asking you to listen. Because here's the secret most empaths never hear. You are not drained because you feel too much. You are drained because you've been carrying what was never yours.
You've mistaken responsibility for love.
Mistaking other people's storms for your own weather. And once you begin to see this pattern, everything begins to shift. This awakening does not announce itself with fireworks or thunder. It begins quietly, in the smallest of moments. A thought, maybe this isn't mine. A pause, what if I don't need to fix this? A whisper in your chest that says, you are allowed to put this down. And when you finally listen, everything you thought was weakness transforms into power. The exhaustion becomes a doorway. The burnout becomes an invitation. The heartbreak becomes a mirror. This isn't the end of your story. It's the beginning of your becoming. But before we can step into that awakening, we need to understand how it begins. Because the empath's story doesn't start in adulthood. It starts long before. It starts in childhood. The story of the empath rarely begins in adulthood. It begins in the earliest years, when a child learns that paying attention isn't just polite, it's survival. Long before you had language for your feelings, you learned how to sense the emotional temperature of the room. You noticed the sigh in your father's chest before he spoke. You noticed the silence in your mother's eyes before she said, "I'm fine." And little by little, without anyone teaching you, you discovered a truth: if you could anticipate the moods of others, you could stay safe. That's the hidden cost of empathy. It doesn't grow from abundance. It grows from scarcity. It grows from an environment where the storms of others mattered more than the needs of your own small body. Most people imagine empathy as this glowing trait, something beautiful, noble, a pure expression of the heart. But in truth, many empaths are not born. They are shaped by chaos, shaped by unpredictability, shaped by the constant vigilance required to avoid conflict. Your empathy was forged like armor, but you wore it so long that no one realized it was armor at all. They thought it was your skin. As a child, you probably noticed things no one else did. The shift in a parent's tone when bills were late. The look in a sibling's eyes that revealed hurt long before words did. You may have tried to soothe, distract, or cheer others up, because deep down you believed if they were okay, you could finally feel okay too. And here's the tragedy. The world praised you for it. They said, "You're so mature, you're so responsible, you're so strong for your age." But hidden inside those compliments was a transaction. You were rewarded for disappearing, for shrinking your needs so that others could expand, for turning off your own tears so you could wipe away someone else's. You thought you were loved for who you were, but often you were loved for how little trouble you caused. You were loved for your usefulness, not your wholeness. This is where the pattern begins. The highly sensitive child who learns to anticipate every emotional storm grows into the adult who feels responsible for everyone else's comfort. You learn to be the friend who listens for hours, even when you're breaking inside. You learn to be the partner who absorbs the anger, the sadness, the fear, because you've been conditioned to believe, if I don't hold everything together, everything will fall apart. And over time, that conditioning becomes exhaustion. You aren't just tired from doing too much, you are tired from being too much for too many people for too long. The hidden cost of empathy is that it makes you the emotional anchor in every room, while leaving you unanchored yourself. But what makes this cost so dangerous is that it's invisible. No one sees the quiet toll it takes. To the outside world, you look calm, supportive, even admirable. They call you strong. They lean on you. They depend on you. But inside, you feel like a candle burning at both ends, each flicker of light costing you more and more wax. Think about the way you've silenced yourself. How many times have you said, "It's fine," when it wasn't? How many times have you smiled when your chest felt heavy? How many times have you swallowed your truth just to keep the peace? That's not empathy. That's survival. And survival, lived long enough, turns into self-erasure. Here's the paradox: what the world praised you for as a child, the maturity, the strength, the sensitivity, is the very thing that now drains you as an adult, because those traits weren't natural expressions of your soul. They were adaptive strategies for staying safe in environments that didn't allow you to simply be. The hidden cost of empathy is this: you forget where you end and others begin. Your nervous system doesn't just notice their emotions, it absorbs them. It mistakes them for your own. And suddenly, you're exhausted without knowing why, anxious without a clear cause, heavy without a name for the weight. And the cruelest part, you think it's your fault. You tell yourself you're too sensitive, too emotional, too weak, when in truth, you are carrying burdens that never belonged to you. You're drowning not in your own pain, but in the unprocessed pain of everyone around you. But awareness changes everything. Once you begin to see the pattern, the cracks appear. You realize that what you thought was love was often training. What you thought was strength was actually hypervigilance. What you thought was empathy was, at times, the child in you still trying to stay safe. This realization hurts. It cuts deep, but it also heals. Because only by seeing the cost can you begin to reclaim what was lost. Only by naming the pattern can you step outside of it. The hidden cost of empathy is real, but it does not have to be permanent. And yet, understanding this hidden cost is just the beginning. Because the exhaustion you feel isn't only about childhood conditioning, it's about something far more immediate, something happening every single day in your adult life. It's not just about who you were, it's about what you're still absorbing now. Because this isn't just burnout, it's something deeper, an energetic overload that most people will never even recognize. Most people think exhaustion comes from doing too much. Long work hours, endless chores, too little sleep. But empaths know a different kind of exhaustion, the kind that doesn't come from action but from absorption. It's not your body that's tired, it's your nervous system, it's your spirit. This is the exhaustion you feel after sitting across from someone who insists they're fine, even while their eyes betray sadness you can't ignore. It's the heaviness that lingers in your chest after a family dinner where everyone smiles, but silence presses down like an invisible storm. It's the inexplicable fatigue that follows you home from work after absorbing the unspoken tension in the office. Most people shake these moments off. They don't notice what isn't said, but you do. You notice the bitterness behind the compliment, the tension woven into a laugh, the way someone's posture tells the truth their mouth refuses to speak. And because you notice, you carry it. Your nervous system doesn't just register it, it holds onto it as if it belongs to you. That's why you wake up tired. That's why you feel drained even when nothing bad happened. Because the truth is, something did happen. You absorbed the static no one else could feel. You walked through invisible storms no one else even noticed. Carl Jung once said that much of what people refuse to face within themselves gets projected outward. And for the empath, those projections don't just float past, they penetrate. You sense them in your bones. You feel them in your skin. You mistake them for your own emotions because they arrive without warning, without label, without explanation. Think of it this way. Most people move through the world with emotional walls. Their nervous systems filter out the subtle cues, the energy beneath the words. But empaths, you're wired differently. It's as if you walk through life with invisible antennas, constantly tuned in to hidden frequencies. And while that makes you perceptive, it also makes you vulnerable. Because when you pick up too many stations at once, the noise becomes unbearable. Real life is rarely filled with dramatic meltdowns. Instead, it's made of small fractures. A friend who says they're happy for you, but whose smile doesn't quite reach their eyes. A partner who insists nothing's wrong, but whose silence feels like a punishment. A colleague who acts cheerful in meetings, but whose energy tells you they're carrying something heavy. To the empath, every one of these moments leaves a mark. They accumulate in your body like sediment at the bottom of a river. One interaction may seem small, but dozens, hundreds, over weeks and years create a weight so constant that you mistake it for your own nature. You begin to think, maybe I really am broken. Maybe I really am too sensitive. Maybe I'm the problem. But the truth is, you are not the problem. The problem is the overload. Your exhaustion comes not from weakness, but from the sheer volume of signals you absorb. Imagine walking around with every Wi-Fi signal in the city plugged directly into your nervous system. Of course, you'd feel drained. That's what it's like for the empath who has never been taught to filter. And here's where the danger lies. Because this overload is invisible, even to you, you often respond the only way you know how. You try harder. You give more. You double down on being nice, being accommodating, being helpful. You think if you can just soothe others enough, their chaos will quiet down and finally give you peace. But instead, it leaves you even emptier, because you're not fixing the source, you're drowning in it. This is why so many empaths confuse survival strategies with love. You don't just want others to feel better, you need them to feel better, because their discomfort vibrates inside your own body. But no matter how much you give, how much you sacrifice, the peace never lasts, because it was never yours to carry in the first place. That's the real heartbreak of the empathic overload. You spend years trying to solve a problem that was never yours. You take responsibility for moods, disappointments, and unspoken resentments that don't belong to you. And eventually, the weight becomes so familiar, you forget what it feels like to live without it. But here's the revelation. This overload isn't proof that you're broken. It's proof that you're absorbing. It's proof that your gift, unguarded, has turned against you. And once you recognize that, you can begin to see your exhaustion for what it really is. Not a flaw, but feedback. A signal that your boundaries have been crossed. A signal that your nervous system has been hijacked. A signal that it's time to step back, to sort what's yours from what isn't. Because the truth is, your sensitivity isn't the enemy. Your sensitivity is sacred intelligence. It's the compass you were born with. But like any instrument, it needs tuning. Without boundaries, it becomes static. With boundaries, it becomes music. And once you begin to filter what you absorb, everything changes. The exhaustion eases. The heaviness lifts. You begin to realize that not every feeling in your chest belongs to you. Not every thought in your head was born inside your mind. And with that clarity, you stop drowning in other people's storms. You start learning how to stand in the rain without becoming soaked. But awareness of overload is only the first step, because the deeper question is, where does all this projection come from? Why do empaths so often end up carrying the shadows of others? To answer that, we have to look at Jung's idea of projection more closely and see how it plays out in the relationships that shape your life. Carl Jung believed that what we refuse to face within ourselves doesn't disappear, it gets projected outward. Think of projection like holding up a mirror, only the mirror is tilted towards someone else. Instead of owning their shame, their rage, their fear, people unconsciously place it onto those around them. They don't say, "I feel inadequate." They say, "You're too demanding." They don't admit, "I feel insecure." They accuse, "You think you're better than me." For most people, these projections bounce off unnoticed. But for empaths, the story is very different. You don't just see the projection, you absorb it. It penetrates. It seeps into your nervous system until you feel like you're the one who's flawed, broken, or wrong. You don't just recognize someone's suppressed rage, you carry the weight of it in your own chest. This is why life as an empath often feels like living with invisible antennas. They're always scanning, always picking up signals that no one else seems to hear. A subtle shift in tone, a glance that lasts a beat too long, a silence that stretches unnaturally. To most people, these details vanish. To you, they are deafening. Imagine walking into a crowded room. Everyone else hears the music, the chatter, the clinking of glasses. You hear that too. But layered on top, your antennas pick up frequencies that don't belong to you. The quiet resentment between two friends standing in the corner. The loneliness of the man laughing too loudly. The anxiety of the woman checking her phone every 30 seconds. It all lands in your body as if it were your own. And here lies the danger. Over time, those antennas stop feeling like tools and start feeling like a curse. You can't turn them off. You can't stop noticing. You can't stop absorbing. So you begin to mistake the noise for your own internal soundtrack. You think, I'm anxious, I'm sad, I'm heavy, when in reality you're carrying echoes of everyone else's unspoken storms. This projection doesn't just come from strangers. In fact, the most damaging projections come from those closest to you: partners, friends, family. These are the people whose shadows you've been trained to carry. Their unacknowledged wounds leak into your interactions, and because you love them, because you want to keep the peace, you take it all on. Think of the times someone said to you, "You're imagining things," when you voiced your intuition. That wasn't your flaw. That was their refusal to face what you had already sensed. Or the time someone told you, "You're too sensitive." That wasn't a neutral observation. It was a projection, a way to make you feel defective so they wouldn't have to confront their own harshness. The empath's antennas make you a magnet for projection because people sense, even unconsciously, that you will carry what they can't. You will hold their disappointment. You will absorb their shame. You will translate their silence into compassion. And while that makes you invaluable in their eyes, it leaves you fragmented in your own. Jung described projection as one of the most powerful and dangerous psychological forces for the empath. It's doubly dangerous because you don't just see it, you live it, you internalize it so deeply that you forget to ask a crucial question: whose emotion is this? When you begin to ask that question, everything shifts. That tightness in your chest after a conversation, was that really your fear? Or did it belong to the person sitting across from you? That sinking feeling in your stomach after a phone call, was that your shame or was it theirs, quietly handed to you because they couldn't bear it themselves? Most empaths never ask. They assume everything they feel is their own. But once you start tracing the origin of those emotions, a startling clarity emerges. You realize you've been walking through life carrying bags that were dropped into your arms without your consent. The antennas that once felt like a curse begin to reveal their purpose. They were never meant to drown you. They were meant to inform you, to show you truths that others can't or won't see. But only if you learn to separate signal from noise. Only if you remember that awareness does not equal responsibility. Because here's the key: you can notice without absorbing. You can witness without carrying. You can sense the projection without becoming the projector's vessel. But that kind of discernment requires awakening. It requires boundaries. And most importantly, it requires recognizing how often these projections come wrapped in something far more sinister: manipulation. Because not everyone projects unconsciously. Some people learn to do it with precision. They learn to use your antennas against you. They learn that if they call you too sensitive, you'll doubt yourself. If they accuse you of imagining things, you'll silence your intuition. If they twist their mistakes into your faults, you'll carry the blame. And that's where the empath's greatest vulnerability collides with the narcissist's greatest weapon. If projection is unconscious, narcissism is projection weaponized. It's not just someone leaking their shame onto you by accident. It's someone deliberately twisting their unhealed wounds into hooks that latch onto your empathy. And if you're the empath in the room, you often become the perfect target. Why? Because you're already conditioned to doubt yourself. You've spent years, maybe decades, being praised for your sensitivity, but punished when that sensitivity revealed inconvenient truths. Narcissists thrive on that exact vulnerability. They know that if they call you too sensitive, you'll second-guess yourself. If they accuse you of imagining things, you'll shrink your truth. If they shift blame onto you, you'll carry it, because carrying is what you've always done. This is how the cycle begins. The narcissist projects their chaos outward, and the empath absorbs it inward. What starts as intuition, your antennas catching subtle signals, becomes confusion, because the narcissist has learned to cloak projection in manipulation, and before you realize it, you're living inside their distorted mirror, doubting your every instinct. Think of the classic gaslighting phrases: you stir overreacting, you sewer imagining things. I wouldn't stet have done that if you hadn't steps. You are too dramatic. On the surface, these might sound like dismissals, but underneath, they are weapons. Each phrase is designed to make you mistrust your perception and hand your reality over to them. The narcissist can't carry their own shame, so they hand it to you. They can't face their own guilt, so they disguise it as yours. They can't admit their fear of inadequacy, so they convince you that you are the one who's never enough. And because you are empathic, because you care deeply, because you were trained from childhood to take responsibility for others' emotions, you accept the trade. You carry the load. You believe them. You adjust, apologize, bend and bend again, until you barely recognize yourself. This is the tragic collision. Empathy without boundaries meets manipulation without conscience. The empath believes love means giving more, fixing more, softening more. The narcissist sees this as permission to take, exploit, and control. You think you're saving the relationship. They're using the relationship to avoid saving themselves. But here's the crucial moment. Eventually, the confusion cracks. Something inside you whispers, "This isn't mine." That single realization is the beginning of awakening. It's the instant you begin to see through the performance, the mask, the projections, the moment you realize that the phrase "you're too sensitive" was never about your feelings. It was about their refusal to face their own. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Hot conversations you once replayed endlessly in your head suddenly reveal themselves as manipulations, not mysteries. The guilt you carried like a stone in your chest begins to look like a leash someone else looped around your neck, and the patterns you thought were love, apologies, overgiving, emotional labor, begin to feel like evidence of how deeply you were ensnared. This awakening isn't dramatic. It doesn't always come with shouting or confrontation. It often comes quietly, a chilling clarity, like mist lifting from a mirror. You see the tactics for what they are: blame shifting, gaslighting, conditional love, manipulation disguised as care. And you realize that none of it was ever about you. But here's the devastating part. You blame yourself first. You think, "I should have known. I should have left earlier. I should have been stronger." That self-blame is the final thread of their control, because it keeps you trapped even when they're gone. The truth is, the narcissist's power never came from their cruelty. It came from your empathy. It came from your willingness to see the good in them, even when they refused to see it themselves. It came from your instinct to heal, to soothe, to carry. And that instinct, while sacred, was never meant to be weaponized against you. Once you realize this, everything begins to shift. You stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start asking, "Whose emotion is this?" You stop trying to decode mixed signals and start noticing the clarity in your own body. The tightness in your chest isn't proof that you're broken. It's proof that you've been absorbing someone else's projections. The confusion in your mind isn't evidence that you're weak. It's evidence that you've been manipulated. Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." For empaths, this means recognizing that the exhaustion, the guilt, the self-doubt you've carried may never have been yours. It was the unconscious shadow of someone else, handed to you in the language of blame. And once you bring that to light, the spell breaks. You see the narcissist not as a monster, but as a mask, a frightened child avoiding their own reflection. You see their superiority as a shield for insecurity, their cruelty as camouflage for shame, and in that moment, their power dissolves. Because the truth is, they never controlled you. They only controlled the story you told yourself about them and about you. And when you reclaim that story, when you see clearly, you step into something sacred, awakening. But clarity alone isn't enough. Awareness is the spark, but the real transformation comes when you begin to act differently. When you shift from absorbing to protecting, from explaining to setting boundaries, from carrying others' pain to reclaiming your peace. And that shift begins with something small, almost imperceptible, but life-changing. Boundaries born not of anger, but of clarity. Awakening rarely arrives with fireworks. It doesn't announce itself in loud declarations or dramatic exits. More often, it slips into your life quietly, like a whisper you almost miss, a thought you've never dared to entertain before. What if this weight isn't mine? That's the moment the fog begins to lift. It doesn't mean the pain vanishes. It doesn't mean the confusion evaporates overnight. But suddenly there's a crack in the wall of self-blame. You replay the conversations you once agonized over, and for the first time, you hear them differently. That phrase, "you're imagining things," no longer sounds like truth. It sounds like deflection. That line, "you're too sensitive," no longer feels like a flaw. It feels like projection. The awakening begins in those small moments of clarity, and once they appear, they multiply. What once left you spinning now leaves you still. What once felt like chaos now reveals itself as a pattern, and patterns, once seen, cannot be unseen. At first, this realization stings. It's like waking up from a dream and realizing you've been carrying someone else's burden for years. You see how often you silenced your own needs to avoid conflict. You remember how many times you bent yourself into impossible shapes, hoping to be easier to love. You realize how long you confused manipulation for affection, conditional approval for love, and the grief hits hard. Because here's the truth. The tragedy of the empath is not only what others did to you, it's how long you blamed yourself for it. You thought you were too emotional, too dramatic, too needy. You believed you were failing at love, when in reality, your only mistake was offering depth to someone who feared their own. This grief is part of the awakening. It's not weakness, it's honesty. It's the heart finally speaking after years of silence, and as painful as it feels, it's the first step toward liberation, because grief clears the ground. It burns away illusions. It makes space for clarity to take root. And clarity is everything. When you realize that the exhaustion you've been carrying was never yours to begin with, a profound shift takes place. You stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start asking, "Whose energy am I carrying?" That question changes everything. Suddenly, the guilt you always felt after setting a boundary doesn't look like your guilt anymore. It looks like theirs. The dread you feel before answering a phone call doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the person on the other end who refuses to face their own discomfort. You begin to see how often your nervous system has been hijacked by projections, how often your empathy has been exploited as compliance. And for the first time, you understand being sensitive was never the problem. The problem was never being taught how to protect your sensitivity. This is where the awakening deepens. You begin to experiment with boundaries, not the kind forged in anger, but the kind born from clarity. You start saying no without writing an essay of justification. You decline invitations that drain you. You stop replying to texts designed to guilt you into compliance. You practice silence, not as punishment, but as self-respect. And something unexpected happens. The world doesn't collapse. The people who manipulated you don't suddenly explode with rage, and if they do, it only confirms the truth you already knew. Instead, you begin to feel lighter. You begin to feel space inside your body again. Space that isn't filled with other people's chaos. At first, this space feels foreign. You've been so accustomed to carrying weight that lightness feels unnatural. You might even feel guilty, as if protecting yourself is selfish. But with time, that guilt fades, replaced by something stronger: sovereignty. The quiet recognition that your energy belongs to you. Carl Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Awakening is the beginning of that privilege. It's when you stop living as a mirror for other people's unhealed wounds and begin to see your reflection clearly for the first time. And here's the beautiful paradox. As you stop absorbing, you actually begin to notice more. But now, what you notice doesn't drown you. It informs you. You see through the masks without mistaking them for truth. You sense the projections without becoming their carrier. You recognize manipulation without turning it inward as self-blame. This is the heart of awakening. Clarity without collapse. Awareness without absorption. Empathy without erasure. But awareness, as powerful as it is only the spark to keep the fire alive. To truly step into your own power, you must move from clarity into practice. You must shift from awakening into transformation. And transformation begins when you understand that boundaries are not walls. They are sacred gates. Awakening cracks the illusion, but the sacred shift is what rebuilds your life. It's the moment you realize clarity alone is not enough. You must act on it. It's not about knowing you've been carrying other people's pain. It's about finally putting it down. The sacred shift begins quietly, with boundaries, not the kind born out of rage or revenge, but the kind rooted in self-respect. You stop explaining yourself into exhaustion. You stop writing novels of justification for why you can't attend a gathering. You stop offering apologies for needs that are human and holy. Instead, your no becomes a full sentence. Your silence becomes your answer. Your peace becomes your proof. At first, it feels radical. The empath who has lived their entire life as an open door suddenly begins to close it. You stop replying to guilt-ridden midnight texts. You decline the family dinner that used to leave you drained for days. You let the phone ring when you know the conversation will end with you feeling smaller. You delete the long paragraph you almost sent, and instead, you breathe. This isn't cruelty. This isn't selfishness. This is reclamation, because for the first time, you're learning that not every open door deserves access, that your energy is not a free resource for others to drain, that your compassion is not currency to be spent recklessly. Boundaries in this stage feel like sacred gates. They're not punishments. They're not walls meant to isolate. They are thresholds that protect what is precious. On the other side of those gates lies your peace, your clarity, your life force. And you're beginning to realize that anyone who wants to step inside must earn that privilege through honesty, respect, and accountability. And when you set those gates, something extraordinary happens. Your nervous system begins to calm. The tightness in your chest starts to ease. The dread that haunted you before phone calls begins to dissolve. For the first time in years, you begin to feel safe in your own body. This stillness, however, is disorienting at first. You've been conditioned to equate love with sacrifice, chaos with connection, exhaustion with loyalty. Peace feels foreign. Quiet feels suspicious. You almost mistake it for abandonment. But slowly, you realize it's not abandonment. It's alignment. You start to notice the subtle ways your body responds differently. You make tea in the morning and actually savor it. You walk outside and hear the sound of birds instead of the noise in your head. You read a book without feeling guilty for resting. You laugh, not because you're performing for someone else, but because joy naturally bubbles up. These aren't small things. They are signs that your energy is returning home. This is the sacred shift, moving from being reactive to being intentional, no longer absorbing whatever enters your orbit, but choosing what you allow in. No longer leaking energy through over-explaining, over-giving, over-functioning, but containing it, guarding it, honoring it. And here's the paradox. You feared boundaries would push people away, but the right people are drawn closer. Because the truth is, your peace is magnetic. When you stop trying to fix everyone, when you stop performing for approval, your presence becomes more powerful, not less. People sense the difference. They notice the stillness. They respect the clarity. But the sacred shift is not only about what you keep out, it's about what you begin to build within. For the first time, you create space for your own voice. You create room for your own intuition. You stop asking, "How do I keep them happy?" and start asking, "What makes me feel whole?" This shift is sacred because it transforms empathy from a wound into a gift. Your sensitivity no longer bleeds through unguarded cracks. It flows with intention. You give when it's right, not when it's demanded. You listen when it's genuine, not when it's manipulative. You help when it aligns with your soul, not when it erases you. And the more you practice, the more you realize the sacred shift isn't about becoming harder. It's about becoming clearer. It's not about shutting people out. It's about inviting in only those who honor the depth you offer. It's not about numbing your sensitivity. It's about protecting it so it can thrive. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." The sacred shift is that moment of making the unconscious conscious, not just in theory, but in practice. You recognize when guilt isn't yours. You notice when shame is being projected. You hear the manipulation beneath the words, and instead of absorbing it, you let it fall. This stage is not without challenges. People who once fed on your compliance may resist. They may guilt, manipulate, lash out, but every reaction only confirms the necessity of your boundary. Every pushback is proof of your progress, and in that resistance, you learn something profound. Your peace is not up for negotiation. The sacred shift is the bridge between awakening and transformation. It's the space where you stop living as a sponge and start living as a flame, no longer soaking up what isn't yours, but radiating light from your center. And as your flame grows steadier, brighter, unshakable, you begin to notice something extraordinary. You are no longer absorbing, you are emitting. And that right there is where the journey turns from survival into power, For most of your life, your energy has been like a sponge. You walked into rooms and soaked up whatever emotions were present: anger that wasn't yours, sadness that wasn't yours, anxiety that wasn't yours. All of it seeped into your nervous system until you felt saturated, heavy, and exhausted. But after awakening and embracing the sacred shift, something remarkable happens. The sponge begins to dry out. Instead of absorbing everything around you, you start to radiate from within. Your sensitivity doesn't disappear. It transforms. It evolves from a liability into a source of power. This is the stage Jung might have called individuation, the process of becoming whole, no longer orbiting around the expectations of others, but centering yourself in truth. You stop measuring your worth by how well you manage other people's storms. Instead, you start creating your own weather, clear, intentional. You'll notice the shift first in your body. The tension you carried for years, the knot in your shoulders, the tightness in your jaw begins to release. Your breath deepens. Your sleep softens. That constant scanning for danger, the hyper-vigilance that defined your childhood, finally begins to rest. For the first time in decades, your nervous system feels like home. And because you are no longer leaking energy, you suddenly have more of it to give. But this time, your giving isn't reactive. It's intentional. You don't soothe others to quiet your own discomfort. You don't overextend yourself to prevent conflict. You don't pour endlessly from an empty cup. Instead, you give from a place of abundance, and it feels completely different. This shift also changes how you move through relationships. Before, you might have entered a room wondering, "Do they like me?" Now you ask, "Do I feel safe here?" You no longer bend your truth to avoid being abandoned. You no longer confuse approval with connection. You've stopped chasing validation, and in doing so, you've reclaimed something priceless: your own presence. And here's the paradox: when you stop absorbing and start radiating, you become magnetic. People are drawn to your stillness, your groundedness, your peace. They can't quite explain why, but they feel better around you. Not because you're carrying their pain, but because you're showing them what it looks like to carry your own energy with grace. This doesn't mean life becomes perfect. Conflicts still arise. People still project. The difference is, you no longer mistake those projections for truth. Someone accuses you of being selfish. You check in with yourself and realize, no, you're simply honoring your boundaries. Someone tells you you're imagining things. You smile quietly, knowing your intuition has been right all along. Someone tries to guilt you back into compliance. You breathe, you stand firm. You let the guilt roll off. And with every instance of choosing clarity over absorption, your radiance grows. You begin to create instead of fix. You write, paint, sing, dance, not for validation, but because joy needs no permission. You start spending time in silence, not as an escape, but as a sanctuary. You rediscover what it feels like to simply be alive in your own skin, without apology, without explanation. Carl Jung called this the movement toward the self, the authentic, whole version of you that has been waiting beneath the noise. And as you touch this self more often, you begin to notice how differently the world responds. Colleagues who once drained you seem less intimidating because you no longer carry their energy. Family gatherings feel less suffocating because you no longer confuse performance with love. Even strangers pick up on it, drawn to the quiet confidence that radiates from someone who no longer seeks approval in every glance. This stage is about shifting your entire orientation. Instead of being a receiver of everyone else's chaos, you become a transmitter of peace. You stop asking, "How can I fit in?" and start asking, "How can I live in alignment?" You stop absorbing shadows and start shining light. And the most powerful part, you don't have to force it. You don't have to try to radiate. It happens naturally, because peace doesn't need to be proven. It simply is. When you protect your energy, when you honor your sensitivity, when you stop leaking your life force into every demand and expectation, your radiance becomes inevitable. This radiance is not flashy. It's not loud. It doesn't seek applause. It's quiet but undeniable, like a steady flame in a dark room. And that flame does something extraordinary. It gives others permission to tend to their own light, without preaching, without convincing, without carrying. That's the secret of this stage. By becoming whole, you stop being a mirror for other people's wounds and start being an invitation for their healing. Your energy becomes a silent teacher, showing others what it looks like to live from center instead of chaos. But to sustain this radiance, you must go deeper. You must move beyond simply protecting yourself and begin fully embodying your sensitivity as power. Because radiating isn't the end of the journey. It's the bridge to becoming magnetic. And that magnetism isn't about drawing everyone in. It's about drawing the right ones closer. The people who can meet you in honesty, respect, and presence. When you stop absorbing and start radiating, something extraordinary unfolds. You become magnetic, not magnetic in the flashy, attention-grabbing sense. Not the kind of magnetism that seeks applause or validation. Your magnetism is quieter, deeper, and far more powerful. It's the kind of presence that shifts a room without a word. People feel it. They may not know why, but they sense something different when you walk in. You no longer arrive carrying the weight of everyone else's emotions. You arrive anchored in your own. That stillness is rare in a world addicted to noise. And because it's rare, it draws people in. Before, you may have believed your value came from doing, from fixing, pleasing, sacrificing. You thought people needed you because of what you could offer. Now you begin to see that your presence itself carries power. It's not what you do that draws others closer. It's who you are when you stop abandoning yourself. This is the paradox of magnetism. When you stop chasing, you attract. When you stop performing, you reveal. When you stop seeking validation, you radiate authenticity, and authenticity is irresistible. Think of the way your relationships begin to change in this stage. A colleague who once drained you suddenly feels less overwhelming because you no longer try to manage their moods. Your calm exposes their chaos without you saying a word. A family gathering that used to fill you with dread now feels different because you no longer contort yourself to fit the script. You sit quietly, unapologetically, and in that stillness, you hold more power than years of over-explaining ever gave you. Even strangers pick up on it. You meet someone new, and instead of asking, "Do they like me?" you ask, "Do I feel safe here?" That single shift changes everything. Because when you stop auditioning for love, you start discerning who deserves to be close. Your magnetism is no longer about pleasing everyone. It's about attracting those who can meet you in honesty, respect, and presence. This stage isn't about becoming untouchable. It's not about building walls or projecting superiority. True magnetism comes from vulnerability combined with boundaries. It's the courage to be fully seen, without bending yourself for approval. It's the clarity to say no without guilt, and yes without hesitation. It's the quiet confidence of someone who knows they don't need to prove their worth. And here's the beauty. Your magnetism teaches without words. People notice how you carry yourself. They notice how you no longer rush to fill silences, how you no longer apologize for your boundaries, how you no longer explain away your intuition. That example plants seeds. Without trying, you give others permission to do the same. But magnetism also exposes, because when you radiate truth, you naturally repel those who thrive on distortion. The people who once exploited your empathy may find themselves uncomfortable around your new clarity. They may accuse you of changing, of becoming cold, of being selfish, but that's not truth. It's resistance. It's the reaction of those who cannot manipulate you anymore. And this is where your strength deepens. You learn to let them go. You realize that not everyone is meant to follow you into your awakening. Some connections can't survive honesty. Some relationships collapse when the performance ends. But instead of mourning what you lose, you begin to celebrate what you gain. The alignment of relationships rooted in respect, reciprocity, and truth. Carl Jung believed individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, naturally reshapes your relationships. As you step into authenticity, only what resonates remains. Everything else falls away. And though it may sting at first, it's liberation disguised as loss. Your magnetism is not about numbers. It's not about being liked by more people. It's about being deeply seen by the right ones. The people who value your depth instead of exploiting it. The ones who respect your boundaries instead of resenting them. The ones who meet your presence with presence of their own. And when those connections emerge, they feel different. Conversations flow without you carrying all the weight. Relationships feel lighter, not because they lack depth, but because they are balanced. You no longer bleed energy just to keep someone else afloat. You meet in the middle, grounded and whole. This magnetism also transforms how you engage with the world at large. Instead of moving through life on defense, bracing for impact, you move with intention. You choose where your energy goes. You decide which rooms deserve your light. You stop being a mirror for unhealed wounds and start being a flame that inspires others to tend their own. And here's the most surprising part. You no longer crave the approval you once thought you needed. Applause feels unnecessary. Validation feels small compared to the quiet power of living in alignment. You realize the crowd was never your compass. Your compass was always your sensitivity, now sharpened and protected. This is the essence of becoming magnetic. You no longer chase love, peace, or belonging. You embody them. And what you embody naturally attracts. But this stage is not the final destination. Magnetism isn't the end of the journey. It's the beginning of something even deeper. Because once you realize your presence carries this much power, the question shifts again. It's no longer, how do I protect my energy? It becomes, how do I embody my soul? Every journey has a turning point. And for the empath, that turning point is the realization that what once felt like a curse was always a calling. You were never too sensitive. You were never too much. You were never broken. What broke you was the way the world taught you to abandon yourself in order to be loved. Now, after awakening, after the sacred shift, after learning to radiate instead of absorb, you stand in a new space. The heaviness that once defined you has begun to lift. The confusion that once clouded your mind has begun to clear. And what's left is something raw, something real, something unshakable, the truth of who you are. This truth is not loud. It does not need to scream. It lives in stillness. It lives in boundaries. It lives in the quiet power of someone who no longer needs to justify their existence. Your life no longer revolves around fixing, proving, or carrying. It revolves around embodying. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And that is the privilege you are stepping into now. Individuation, the process of becoming whole, isn't about becoming someone new. It's about remembering who you've always been beneath the noise, beneath the masks, beneath the guilt and shame handed to you by others. This is why the breakdown was never the end. It was the beginning. The exhaustion you once cursed was actually an invitation. The heartbreak that shattered you was actually a mirror. The moments that made you feel small were actually guiding you back to yourself. Every piece of pain carried within it the seed of becoming. Now you understand healing isn't about going back. It's not about returning to the naive openness of your childhood or the desperate caretaking of your adulthood. Healing is about rising into something new, a self that is sensitive yet strong, open yet boundaried, compassionate yet discerning. A self that embodies paradox, because paradox is where wholeness lives. And in this wholeness, you no longer seek validation from the crowd. You no longer bend yourself for love that demands performance. You no longer confuse loyalty with self-erasure. Instead, you show up as you are, and you let that be enough, because it is enough. It has always been enough. What happens next is extraordinary. Life begins to mirror your shift. You attract relationships that honor your depth instead of exploiting it. You find conversations that energize you instead of draining you. You notice opportunities that align with your truth instead of demanding your silence. And perhaps most importantly, you stop running from yourself. You begin to enjoy your own company, not as a distraction, but as a sanctuary. This doesn't mean the world stops projecting. It doesn't mean manipulation disappears, but now you see it clearly. You recognize it for what it is, and you choose differently. You don't absorb, you don't explain, you don't carry, you let it fall. And in that letting go, you protect the most sacred thing you have, your energy. Because your energy is not just personal, it's spiritual. It's the life force that fuels your creativity, your joy, your relationships, your presence. And when you stop giving it away recklessly, it grows brighter, steadier, and more magnetic. You stop being defined by what you've endured and start being defined by what you embody. And this embodiment is the true gift of the empath's journey. It's the moment you realize you were never meant to numb your sensitivity. It was always meant to guide you. You were never meant to carry everyone else's storms. You were meant to learn how to walk through them with clarity. You were never meant to be a mirror for others. You were meant to be a light for yourself. Now the question is no longer, how do I survive my sensitivity? The question is, how do I live fully with it? And the answer is simple. Though not always easy, you live truthfully. You honor your body's signals as sacred wisdom. You protect your boundaries like gates to a temple. You give intentionally instead of compulsively. You love without losing yourself. You walk into silence and know it is safety, not abandonment. This is your becoming. Not bitter, just boundaried. Not cold, just clear. Not weak, but awake. And as you embody this truth, the world shifts around you. People notice your presence. They feel your calm. They respect your boundaries. They may not always understand you, but they cannot ignore you. Because authenticity is unshakable, and once you taste it, you never go back. So here you are, not broken, but reborn, not surviving, but becoming. The sponge has become a flame. The vessel has become a source. The empath has become whole. And if you carry one truth forward, let it be this: your sensitivity was never your weakness. It was your compass. It led you here, and it will continue to lead you home again and again to the self you were always meant to be. So breathe, rest, trust, and walk into this new chapter knowing that the privilege of your lifetime is not to carry the world, but to finally unapologetically embody your soul.